When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I did something very wild and crazy. I read the Vatican II documents of Lumen Gentium, that is the dogmatic constitution on the Church, and Gaudium et Spes, or the pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world. I did this voluntarily, not for a class or a reading group, I was in public school at the time, or out of coercion. It was my own choice. But why? By the time I hit high school in 1969 and into the early 1970s, there was a lot of confusing information being disseminated out of Catholic institutions, particularly in Catholic schools. A great deal of liturgical experimentation was underway in some places, and some of it was bewildering to many people, including me. I had to trust that what I was hearing and seeing was okay with church authority, even though priests living in the same rectory passed on conflicting information, as did some of the sisters living in the parish convent. Many Catholics were not shy about expressing their opinions as authoritative, so if I wanted straight answers free of the filter of popular opinions, I needed to research the answers for myself. In this vlog, I will be sharing how I found my footing at a time in my life when it felt like everything I held as sacred had been stripped away, leaving me adrift and at times empty inside. Please join me. At his inauguration in January 1961, President John Kennedy proclaimed, "The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans." Many young Americans, including young Catholic women and men, were inspired by this new young Catholic president to become more involved in politics and in building a world that was compassionate and just. Although the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 put our nerves on edge, many of us who longed for a future blessed by brotherhood and sisterhood found encouragement in the words of the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the March on Washington in 1963, when he delivered his most famous "I Have a Dream" speech. However, in just a few short months, this hopeful view of the future was shattered. On November 22, 1963, the much-beloved President John Kennedy was assassinated by a shotgun fired by a crazed Soviet sympathizer from a school book depository window as the President and First Lady Jackie Kennedy rode through the streets of Dallas in an open vehicle. The sudden loss of a young and inspiring president had a devastating impact on the entire country. Though civil rights and voting rights acts were passed under President Lyndon Johnson, the United States' involvement in the war in Vietnam escalated, much to the dissatisfaction of young men facing the draft. In April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and 2 months later, just after winning the Democratic nomination in California, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Then in 1972, there was the Watergate scandal. The many horrific incidents that transpired throughout the 1960s left many young people distraught as they faced a world that appeared to be dissolving into turmoil. Places of learning, high schools, colleges, and universities exploded in protests. Many groups took to the streets in the late 1960s and early 1970s to protest the war in Vietnam and many other injustices. Institutions, both government and religious, were viewed with distrust. It became normal to question every tradition and doctrine passed on by older generations. The great hopes that burned so brightly early in the decade now melted away into a spirit of pessimistic cynicism. This strident and rebellious fervor found its way into Catholic high schools, seminaries, monasteries, and convents. I had two older brothers attending Catholic high schools at the time, one in the local minor seminary. It would be unfair to characterize all priests, religious, and lay instructors in these institutions of learning as teaching heresy, as some people would say today. I suspect that my siblings were selectively attentive to those educators who most appealed to their adolescent rebellious minds at the time. Nevertheless, much of what they said did confuse me, and I wondered if they were honestly representing what was the Church's official teaching in the wake of Vatican II. For this reason, I read these documents for myself. Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church, was for me a light, as the title suggests, in what was for me a time of darkness in my early adolescence. This document reaffirmed what I had been taught about the nature of the Church and its teaching authority. Lumen Gentium clearly stated that the teaching authority and matters regarding regulations and norms were still in the hands of the Holy Father, the Pope. His teachings were not intended to be viewed as mere personal opinion, as many people at the time were stating. But what was new was the way in which the principles of the document were laid out. Rather than in cold legalistic language that characterized past documents, the Vatican II documents provided an historical and theological context in language, albeit translated, that was easily understood by a boy of 14 or 15. A new term, collegiality, appeared in the language of Vatican II to describe the relationship that exists between the bishops and the Pope in a bond of unity, charity, and peace. Although the Pope continued to hold the place of supreme teaching authority in the hierarchy of the Church, the bishops throughout the world shared in this authority at the local level. One place in which local bishops enjoyed an increased amount of autonomy was in the Bishops' Conference in individual countries. This was most evident in the documents on the liturgy, where episcopal conferences in each country were given authority to adapt certain liturgical elements as applicable to the culture of a given country. Another expression found in Lumen Gentium is the Church as the people of God. Though I do not believe that concept was entirely new, to find it as a title of the section in Lumen Gentium that preceded the section on the hierarchy was quite remarkable. The Council Fathers were presenting a more holistic approach to this concept of church that was broader than simply an hierarchical institution that, to this day, dominates most people's perceptions of what is meant by the idea of church. Having lived through that era and persevered in my faith through some dark moments, I find myself amused by some present-day misconceptions of exactly how things fell out back in the 1960s and 70s. When the 1960s dawned, there was not an overnight jump from bobby socks and poodle skirts to tie-dyed t-shirts and psychedelic art. And as for the Church, a revolution did not break out all of a sudden as Pope John XXIII convened the Council. The Council ended in 1965. Here in the United States, a few changes had been rolled out in the liturgy, but if anyone was questioning those changes, I was certainly unaware of it. Even as the Summer of Love unfolded in San Francisco, my parish school remained largely untouched until the very end of my 8 years of parochial education. Instead of inspiring confusion and mayhem, the Council provided some amount of space and flexibility to allow room for those challenges that a more inflexible structure may not have been able to hold. The most volatile years were not that many, and not all places were being shaken to their foundations. One very strong memory I have of the early 1970s was the emergence of a renewed interest in prayer and spirituality. Perhaps I was aware of it because of my own growing attraction to monastic spirituality at the time. But I do remember entering into discussions with people about the early spiritual works of Thomas Merton, the Way of the Pilgrim, and the practice of the presence of God. In 1973, the Carmelite order in the United States observed the 100th birthday of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux with a new translation of her autobiography, Story of a Soul. Also, at the same time, new English editions of the works of St. John of the Cross were published. Even though some devotions for a time had lost popularity, other interests in Catholic prayer and spirituality were making a comeback. I remember attending some very fine adult theology and spirituality classes in the early 1970s. As I look back at these moments, I remember a number of missed opportunities for clergy, particularly in church leadership, to nourish that hunger. Instead of encouraging that search for prayer and a deeper, more personal encounter with the Lord, attention became more focused on what divides us in the arts, sciences, theology, and politics. I wish that more had been done by clergy, religious, and the emerging lay ministry to encourage these developments. I believe too many in leadership got caught up in a power struggle between the experimenters on one side and the authoritarians on the other. Many spiritual needs of the meek and faithful suffered neglect in this battle for relevance. This is the void that I hope to fill in my Monastic Musings vlogs. Please help me in my mission here by subscribing to my channel. Please like this video, and if you can, donate to my GoFundMe page. All links are provided below. Thank you for joining me, and until next time, peace be with you.